The ruins of Stalingrad stretch endlessly through Katya's rifle scope, a graveyard of twisted steel and shattered concrete where every shadow could hide death. Winter 1942 has turned the city into a frozen nightmare, and German forces are closing in on the final Soviet strongholds. But Katya Volkov isn't just another Red Army sniper. She's the White Death of the Volga, credited with 127 confirmed kills. Today feels different. Someone is hunting her. For months, she's been the predator, picking off Nazi officers from impossible distances. Her reputation has grown into legend, striking fear into enemy ranks. But now, scrawled messages in perfect Russian appear near her positions. "I know who you really are, princess." The name makes her blood freeze. Only one person from her past life as Moscow nobility could know that childhood nickname. The counter-sniper stalking her isn't just any German marksman. It's someone who knew her before the war, before she became a weapon forged in Soviet steel. As artillery thunder shakes the rubble around her, Katya realizes this isn't just about survival anymore. It's about confronting the aristocratic past she thought she'd buried forever. But how did a childhood friend become her most dangerous enemy? Katya adjusts her position on the third floor of what was once an apartment building, her breath forming small clouds in the bitter air. The Mosin Nagant rifle feels heavier today, weighted not just with ammunition but with dread. Through the jagged hole that serves as her shooting port, she scans the German positions across the frozen Volga. Movement catches her eye, a flash of field grey ducking behind rubble near the factory district. Her finger hovers over the trigger, but something holds her back. In all her months of warfare, she's never hesitated. The enemy was the enemy, clear and simple. Now uncertainty gnaws at her like the cold that seeps through her worn winter gear. The sound of boots on broken glass makes her freeze. Someone is climbing the stairs behind her. In one fluid motion, she swings the rifle around, finger on the trigger, only to see Dmitri's familiar face emerging from the stairwell. Her spotter and closest friend in this hellscape raises his hands with a nervous grin. "Easy, White Death. It's just me." His voice carries the easy familiarity of shared danger. "You seem on edge today, more than usual." Katya lowers the rifle but doesn't relax. "Have you noticed anything unusual? Anyone asking questions about me?" Dmitri's expression grows serious as he settles beside her, pulling out his binoculars. "Now that you mention it, Captain Volkov intercepted a German radio transmission yesterday. They were specifically requesting information about our snipers, not positions or numbers, personal information." The chill that runs down Katya's spine has nothing to do with the weather. She turns back to her scope, scanning the enemy lines with renewed intensity. What kind of personal information? Names, backgrounds, the kind of details you'd need if you wanted to get inside someone's head. Dmitri pauses, studying her profile. "Katya, is there something you're not telling me? In all the months we've worked together, you've never seemed rattled." Before she can answer, something catches her attention. A piece of paper, weighted down with a stone, sits on the windowsill of a bombed building directly across from her position. It wasn't there an hour ago. The placement is deliberate, positioned exactly where she would see it through her scope. "Dmitri, do you see that paper? Building across from us, second floor window?" He adjusts his binoculars. "I see it. Want me to—" The crack of a rifle shot cuts him off. The bullet splinters the concrete inches from Katya's head, sending fragments of debris across her cheek. She drops immediately, pulling Dmitri down with her. Her heart pounds as the implications hit her. Someone had been watching, waiting for her to expose herself. "That shot came from at least 800 meters, Dmitri whispers, his face pale. "Whoever that was, they're good. Very good." Katya wipes blood from the small cuts on her cheek, her mind racing. The placement of that paper, the precision of the shot, it was all too calculated. Someone wanted her to know they could have killed her, but chose not to. This wasn't about elimination, it was about psychological warfare. "We need to move," she says, already gathering her equipment. This position is compromised. As they prepare to relocate, she can't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, someone who once knew her as Princess Ekaterina Volkov, daughter of a disgraced noble family, survivor of the purges, is playing a game whose rules she doesn't understand. The war had given her a new identity, a purpose, a chance to serve the motherland that had taken everything from her family. Now that past was reaching across the battlefield like a ghost, threatening to destroy the person she'd fought so hard to become. The hunter had indeed become the hunted, but the prey they sought wasn't just the white death of the Volga. They were hunting the girl she used to be. The rifle barrel was still warm when Katya slid it through the jagged gap in the factory wall. Ice crystals formed on her breath as she settled into position, the familiar weight of the Mosin Naganta comfort against the chaos erupting 3 blocks away. German mortars had been pounding the tractor factory since dawn, and smoke billowed across the skeletal remains of what had once been Stalingrad's industrial heart. She adjusted her scope, scanning the rubble-strewn wasteland that separated Soviet positions from the enemy line. Somewhere out there, fascist soldiers were preparing for another assault. Her job was to make sure fewer of them made it across no man's land. A movement caught her eye, field grey against the brown stone of a collapsed apartment building. Through her scope she watched a German soldier emerge from cover, his rifle slung across his back as he gestured to unseen comrades. An officer, judging by his confident posture. Perfect. Katya controlled her breathing, feeling her heartbeat slow to that meditative rhythm she'd learned during her first winter in the city. The wind was negligible, the range approximately 200 meters. She placed the crosshairs just above the man's sternum and began to squeeze the trigger. The crack of a rifle split the air, but it wasn't hers. The brick inches from her head exploded in a shower of dust and fragments. Katya rolled away from the window, her pulse spiking as she pressed herself against the wall. Someone had been watching her position, waiting for her to expose herself, someone good enough to nearly take her head off from an impossible angle. She lay still for 30 seconds, listening to the distant rumble of artillery and the closer sound of her own breathing. Then she began to move, crawling along the wall toward a different firing position. The shot had come from the southeast, probably the upper floors of the bombed-out school that overlooked this section of the factory district. She'd used that building herself 2 days ago. As she settled behind a new pile of rubble, Katya noticed something that made her blood run cold. Carved into the brick beside her previous position, barely visible unless you knew where to look, was a small symbol, a stylized eagle with outstretched wings. She'd seen that mark before, in the villages outside Moscow where she'd earned her reputation. It was the calling card of someone who knew exactly who she was. The morning stretched into afternoon as an invisible game of chess played out across the ruins. Katya would take position, acquire a target, and find herself forced to abandon the shot when rifle fire erupted from a new quarter. Her opponent was patient, methodical, and frustratingly skilled. Twice she thought she'd spotted his muzzle flash, but when she maneuvered for a clear shot, she found only empty windows and shadow. By the time the winter sun began its early descent, 3 more Soviet snipers had taken positions in the surrounding buildings. Word had spread through the chain of command that something unusual was happening in the factory district. Senior Lieutenant Volkov himself had crawled through the trenches to reach her position, his thin face grim beneath his fur cap. "How many?" he asked, settling beside her in the ruins of what had been a foreman's office. "Just one," Katya replied, not taking her eye from the scope. "But he's not like the others." Volkov grunted. He'd seen enough of Katya's work to know she didn't rattle easily. If she was concerned, there was reason to be. "What makes him special?" Before she could answer, another rifle cracked in the distance. Volkov's radio operator, positioned 50 meters to their left, slumped forward without a sound. The shot had come from the north this time, a completely different building from where Katya had been tracking movement all day. "He's mobile," she said simply, "and he knows our tactics." As if to emphasize her point, a piece of paper fluttered down from the grey sky above, carried by the wind from the direction of the German lines. Volkov snatched it from the air, his expression darkening as he read the neat German script. "What does it say?" Katya asked, though part of her already knew. "It's addressed to you," Volkov said slowly. "By name, your real name." The temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Katya had been Ekaterina Volkov for 2 years now, her true identity buried under layers of Soviet bureaucracy and wartime necessity. Only a handful of people knew the name she'd been born with, and most of them were dead. "What else?" Volkov's jaw tightened. "He says he's been looking forward to this meeting, that you have something that belongs to him." He crushed the paper in his fist. "Who is this man, Katya? What aren't you telling me?" She lowered her rifle and met his eyes for the first time since he'd arrived. In the distance, another mortar round exploded against the factory walls, showering them with debris. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible above the sound of war. "Someone I thought I'd killed a long time ago." The frozen corpse of the German officer lay sprawled across the rubble, his Mauser rifle still clutched in his death grip. Katya crouched beside him, her breath forming clouds in the bitter air as she searched his uniform for intelligence. Her fingers, stiff despite her wool-lined gloves, found a leather map case tucked inside his greatcoat. "Anything useful?" whispered Dmitri, her spotter, as he kept watch through the bombed-out window of what had once been a bakery. Katya unfolded the documents, squinting in the dim light filtering through the smoke-choked sky. German tactical maps, unit positions, supply routes, all valuable intelligence for headquarters. But it was the last document that made her blood run cold. A photograph. Her photograph. The image showed her in her dress uniform, accepting a medal from a Soviet general. Someone had written notes in precise German script along the margins. "Katya Volkov, 127 confirmed kills. Operates in Stalingrad factory district. Preferred positions, elevated, southwest exposure. Left-handed shooter. We need to move. Now." She stuffed the documents into her pack, her mind racing. How had they obtained this photograph? Who had provided such detailed information about her tactics? Dmitri caught the urgency in her voice. They gathered their equipment quickly, muscle memory guiding them through the routine they'd performed dozens of times. But as Katya slung her rifle across her shoulder, she noticed something that made her pause. Scratched into the wall beside the window, barely visible in the concrete dust and debris, were 3 parallel lines. Recent marks made with the tip of a knife or bayonet. She'd seen similar markings twice before in the past week, always in positions where she'd been operating. Someone was tracking her movements. They descended through the building's shattered stairwell, moving like ghosts through the skeleton of Stalingrad's urban decay. The factory district stretched before them, a hellscape of twisted metal and burning ruins where Soviet workers had died at their machines rather than surrender to the Wehrmacht. The sound of artillery echoed from the north, where the 62nd Army was mounting another desperate defense. But here, in this pocket of devastation, an eerie quiet prevailed. Too quiet. Katya held up her fist, signaling Dmitri to stop. Something was wrong. The usual sounds of urban warfare, distant gunfire, shouted orders, the rumble of tanks, seemed muffled, as if the very air was holding its breath. A glint of metal caught her eye from across the street, positioned in the upper floor of a destroyed munitions factory. She focused on the spot, studying the shadows and angles. There, the outline of a rifle barrel, barely visible through a gap in the broken masonry. But this wasn't a careless German patrol or an inexperienced Wehrmacht sniper. The position was perfectly chosen, with multiple escape routes and excellent fields of fire. Whoever was up there understood the art of marksmanship at her level. She motioned for Dmitri to take cover behind a pile of concrete slabs. Using hand signals, she indicated the enemy position. Her spotter raised his binoculars, studying the building for several tense minutes. "I can't get a clear visual," he whispered. "But there's definitely movement up there. Professional concealment." Katya's mind catalogued her options. The direct approach was suicide. Whoever was across the street would be expecting that. She could try to outflank the position, but that would take time, and time meant allowing the enemy to possibly relocate or call for reinforcements. Then she remembered the intelligence photograph, the detailed notes about her preferences and tactics. This wasn't a random encounter. Someone had been studying her, learning her patterns, anticipating her moves. The hunter had become the hunted. A new sound drifted across the rubble-strewn street. 3 sharp taps, metal on stone, then silence. 30 seconds later, the pattern repeated. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps. Dmitri looked at her with confusion, but Katya understood. It was a message, a challenge. The enemy sniper was announcing his presence, drawing her into a deadly game of skill and patience. She closed her eyes, forcing herself to think beyond her training, beyond the tactical doctrine that had kept her alive through months of urban warfare. Her opponent knew how she fought when she followed the rules. The only way to survive was to break them. Opening her eyes, she spotted a drainage pipe that ran along the building's foundation, partially collapsed, but still providing concealment. It would be a difficult shot from that angle, nearly impossible for most snipers. But Katya wasn't most snipers. She turned to Dmitri, her voice barely audible. "When I give the signal, I want you to create a distraction. Throw something toward the building on our left, make them think we're flanking from that direction." Her spotter nodded, understanding the desperate nature of their situation. Katya checked her rifle one final time, feeling the familiar weight of the weapon that had become an extension of her will. Somewhere across the street, a patient killer was waiting for her to make the first mistake. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. The abandoned factory loomed like a skeletal giant against the ash-grey sky, its broken windows staring down at the rubble-strewn streets below. Katya pressed herself against the cold brick wall, her Mosin-Nagant rifle clutched tight against her chest. 3 days had passed since the encounter with the German sniper, and sleep had become a luxury she couldn't afford. Every shadow could conceal death, every broken window a potential nest for her hunter. She moved through the building with practiced silence, her boots finding the solid beams beneath rotting floorboards. The scent of cordite and decay hung heavy in the air, mixed with the metallic tang of frozen blood. This sector had changed hands 4 times in the past week, leaving behind a graveyard of uniforms from both armies. Setting up her rifle on a stable beam, she calculated distance and wind. 400 meters, slight crosswind from the northwest. The officer would be first, cut off the head, and confusion would follow. She lined up the shot, her breathing slow and controlled, finger finding the familiar curve of the trigger. The crack of a rifle split the morning air, but it wasn't hers. The beam beside her head exploded in a shower of splinters. Katya rolled left, scrambling for cover as another shot punched through the wall where she'd been lying. He'd found her first. The German patrol below scattered, seeking shelter as they tried to locate the source of the gunfire. Katya's mind raced. 2 shots, both from the northeast, approximately 600 meters. The cathedral bell tower, it had to be. The structure still stood mostly intact, offering multiple firing positions and clear sightlines across the district. She'd considered using it herself, but deemed it too obvious. Apparently, her opponent had no such concerns. A 3rd shot shattered the window frame above her head. Glass rained down, and Katya felt a shard slice across her cheek. The shots were getting closer, more precise. He was walking his fire, adjusting for her movement. Professional, patient, deadly. She needed to move, but any motion toward a window would expose her. The German patrol below had taken cover, but hadn't retreated. They knew their sniper was up there somewhere, pinning down the threat. She was trapped between hammer and anvil. The sound of boots on debris came from the stairwell behind her. The Germans were moving into the building. Katya counted at least 4 sets of footsteps, maybe more. They'd be here in minutes, sweeping floor by floor while their sniper kept her pinned. A memory surfaced unbidden. Katya Volkov, age 7, hiding in a grain cellar while Cossack raiders burned her village. Even then she'd known that survival meant making impossible choices. Her father had taught her that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but action in spite of it. Katya pulled a smoke grenade from her belt, one of 3 she'd salvaged from a dead German lieutenant. She pulled the pin and rolled it toward the eastern windows. Thick grey smoke began billowing outward, creating a screen between her position and the cathedral. The boots were closer now, voices calling out in German. They were being methodical, checking each room. She had perhaps a minute before they reached this floor. Moving low, she reached the opposite side of the building where a bombing raid had torn away an entire wall. The drop to the next building was manageable, 10 feet down to a relatively intact roof. But the moment she appeared in that gap, she'd be exposed to the cathedral sniper for at least 3 seconds. In sniper terms, that was an eternity. The German voices were directly below her floor now. No choice left. Katya slung her rifle across her back and sprinted toward the gap. She leaped as another rifle crack echoed across the ruins, feeling the bullet's passage like a whisper of death past her ear. She landed hard on the adjacent roof, rolled to absorb the impact, and kept moving. Behind her, shouts erupted as the German patrol reached the abandoned floor. Ahead lay a maze of bombed-out buildings and rubble-filled streets. She could lose herself in that labyrinth, find a new position, turn the hunt around. But as she ran, one thought burned in her mind like a brand. The cathedral sniper hadn't just found her by chance. The shots had been too precise, the positioning too perfect. He'd known exactly where she'd be, almost as if he'd been reading her tactical manual. Someone had told him how she thought, how she moved, how she chose her positions. Someone who knew Katya Volkov's methods better than anyone should. The hunter had indeed become the hunted, but the game was more dangerous than she'd imagined. The abandoned factory stretched before Katya like a steel graveyard, its twisted girders and shattered windows creating a maze of shadows and death. She moved through the rubble with practiced silence, her Mosin Nagant cradled against her chest, every sense alert for the slightest disturbance. The morning mist hung thick between the machinery, muffling sound and reducing visibility to mere meters. 3 days had passed since the German sniper's taunting message, and the psychological warfare was taking its toll. She'd barely slept, jumping at every distant gunshot, analyzing every angle of approach to her positions. He was out there somewhere, studying her patterns, learning her habits. The thought made her skin crawl. A metallic clang echoed from the far end of the factory floor. Katya froze, pressing herself against a concrete pillar. The sound came again, deliberate, measured, too regular to be debris settling. Someone was moving through the factory, and they weren't trying very hard to hide it. Her mind raced through possibilities. German patrol? Unlikely. They rarely ventured this deep into the contested zone during daylight. Soviet reconnaissance? Possible, but they would have announced themselves by now. That left one chilling option. Her hunter was here, and he wanted her to know it. She slipped between the machinery, using the industrial equipment as cover. The factory had been a tractor plant before the war, its assembly lines now twisted monuments to destruction. Steam pipes hung at odd angles, their insulation torn away like exposed nerves. Every surface was scarred by shrapnel and painted with rust-colored stains that might not all be rust. Another sound. Footsteps on metal grating. Closer now. Katya peered around a massive lathe, its cutting tools still gleaming despite the devastation. Movement caught her eye. A figure in field grey, moving with predatory patience through the shadows 50 meters away. He was tall, lean, with the fluid grace of an experienced marksman. His rifle was different from the standard Mauser, longer barrel, specialized scope. A weapon built for one purpose, killing at distance. Even through the gloom, she could see the confidence in his movements. This was a man who had never lost a hunt. The German paused at a junction between 2 assembly lines, and for a moment, Katya thought she saw him smile. He knew she was watching. This wasn't a hunt anymore, it was a dance, and he was leading. She had 2 choices: retreat and live to fight another day, or take the shot and end this psychological torment. Her finger found the trigger guard as she weighed the odds. The range was manageable, but the lighting was poor and her target was partially concealed. Miss, and she'd give away her position to a marksman who wouldn't make the same mistake. The decision was made for her when the German suddenly raised his rifle, not toward her position but to the factory's upper level. Following his aim, Katya's blood turned to ice. 3 Soviet soldiers were crossing the elevated walkway, completely unaware of the danger below. They were young, barely old enough to shave, carrying ammunition to the forward positions. Time compressed to a crystalline moment. She could let the German take his shot, preserving her concealment and the deadly game between them. 3 lives against the strategic advantage of staying hidden. The calculus of war demanded such choices, but something deeper than strategy moved her hand. The Mosin Nagant came up smooth and fast. She found her sight picture just as the German's finger tightened on his trigger. No time for careful breathing or perfect position, just instinct and training compressed into a fraction of a second. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, its report echoing through the factory like thunder. Her bullet caught the German sniper in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his shot wide. The young soldiers on the walkway dove for cover as the enemy round sparked off steel beams above their heads. For a heartbeat, Katya thought she had him. But the German was already moving, professional composure intact despite the wound. He rolled behind a steam press, clutching his shoulder but still maintaining control of his weapon. Blood seeped between his fingers, dark against the grey uniform. When he looked in her direction, his expression held no pain or anger, only a cold satisfaction that chilled her more than the winter air. "Katya Volkov," he called out in accented Russian, his voice carrying clearly across the factory floor. "You haven't forgotten your real name, have you?" The words hit harder than any bullet. Only a handful of people knew that name, and most of them were dead. Her past, buried under layers of manufactured identity and state secrets, had somehow found its way into enemy hands. The implications were staggering and terrifying. The German was moving again, using the machinery for cover as he worked his way toward an exit. She had wounded him, but he was far from finished. If anything, drawing first blood had only confirmed what he already suspected. He had found his true quarry. The frozen concrete bit into Katya's cheek as she pressed herself against the rubble, watching the building across the street through her scope. 3 hours had passed since the morning's deadly game of cat and mouse, and the silence stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Her breath formed small clouds in the bitter air, each exhalation a potential death sentence that could give away her position. She had moved 4 times since dawn, never staying in one nest longer than necessary. The German sniper, this ghost who seemed to know her every habit, had already proven he could anticipate her movements with uncanny precision. The bullet that had nearly claimed her life earlier still echoed in her mind, a whisper of death that had passed mere centimeters from her skull. Vasily's voice crackled through the radio tucked against her ear. "Raven, we've identified movement in Sector 7, 3-story building, northwest corner." She adjusted her position slightly, training her rifle toward the coordinates. The Mosin Nagant felt heavier than usual in her hands, or perhaps it was the weight of knowing that somewhere in this maze of destruction, someone was hunting her with the same methodical patience she had perfected over months of warfare. A flash of reflected light caught her attention, brief, almost imperceptible, from a window on the 2nd floor of a bombed-out apartment building. Amateur mistake, she thought, but something nagged at her. Too obvious, too convenient. "I see it," she whispered into the radio. "Possible muzzle flash reflection, grid reference 4 to 7 alpha. Confirmed. Do you have a shot?" Katya steadied her breathing, finger hovering over the trigger. Through her scope she could make out the shadow of a figure behind the window frame. The distance was manageable, roughly 300 meters, but something felt wrong. The target was too exposed, too careless for someone who had demonstrated such lethal precision earlier. She held her fire. Minutes crawled by like hours. The figure in the window remained motionless, and gradually Katya began to understand. It was a decoy, a dummy dressed in German uniform, positioned to draw her shot and reveal her location, which meant the real sniper was somewhere else entirely, probably watching this very building through his own scope, waiting for her to take the bait. A bead of sweat froze against her temple despite the sub-zero temperature. This opponent was playing a game several moves ahead, just as she would have done. The realization sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the weather. She began a careful retreat, sliding backward on her belly across the debris-strewn floor. Every movement had to be calculated, silent, invisible. As she reached the rear of her position, a chunk of masonry exploded inches from her head. The crack of the rifle shot echoed a split second later. He had found her. Katya rolled hard to her left, scrambling behind the relative safety of a collapsed wall. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she tried to triangulate the shot's origin. The angle suggested he was positioned in the building directly behind where she had been watching, the one place she hadn't considered because it seemed too far for an accurate shot. But this was no ordinary marksman. Another bullet sparked off the concrete near her feet as she sprinted toward the building's rear exit. He was tracking her movement, leading his shots with the skill of someone who had done this many times before. The controlled spacing between rounds told her he was using a bolt-action rifle, probably a Mauser, which gave her a narrow window between shots to move. She burst through a doorway into what had once been a kitchen, now reduced to rubble and twisted metal. The building's back wall had been partially destroyed by artillery, creating a jagged opening that led to an adjoining structure. Without hesitation, she dove through the gap. The impact with the floor drove the air from her lungs, but she forced herself to keep moving. Speed was survival now. The methodical game of patience had become a deadly sprint through the urban wasteland. As she reached a stairwell, Vasily's voice crackled again through static. "Raven, we're moving support units to your position. Hold tight. Negative," she gasped, taking the stairs two at a time. "Stay back. This one is mine." She emerged onto the building's third floor, quickly assessing her new vantage point. From here, she could see the position where her adversary had been shooting. The window was empty now. He had moved as soon as he'd forced her to run. But movement meant opportunity. Somewhere in this frozen labyrinth, he was repositioning just as she was. The question was, who would find the better angle first? Katya settled into a new firing position, controlling her breathing as her pulse gradually slowed. The hunter had indeed become the hunted, but the game was far from over. In the distance, smoke rose from a dozen fires, and the war continued its relentless grinding advance. But for now, in this small corner of hell, there were only two players left on the board. The abandoned textile factory stretched before Katya like a concrete maze of death. 3 stories of shattered windows and collapsed walls created perfect shooting galleries, while the basement level offered a labyrinth of maintenance tunnels that could serve as either escape routes or traps. She moved through the ground floor shadows, her rifle cradled against her chest, every sense heightened to razor sharpness. Somewhere in this skeletal building, Koenig was hunting her. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd chosen this place specifically because it reminded her of the Leningrad apartment blocks where she'd first learned to kill. But now those familiar angles and sightlines felt alien, contaminated by the presence of someone who knew her methods better than she knew his. A piece of debris shifted 2 floors above. Katya froze, controlling her breathing as she listened to the building's symphony of settling concrete and wind-blown snow. The sound hadn't been random, too deliberate, too controlled. Koenig was moving, but where? She slipped toward the central stairwell, keeping to the wall where the floorboards were less likely to betray her position. The factory's layout worked in her favor here. She knew every inch from her reconnaissance, while Koenig was operating blind. Or so she hoped. The first shot exploded a chunk of concrete inches from her head. Katya dove left, rolling behind a fallen support beam as the second shot sparked off the floor where she'd been standing. The reports came from the 3rd floor, eastern corner, exactly where she would have positioned herself. Koenig wasn't just skilled, he thought like her. She low-crawled toward the stairs, using the scattered machinery as cover. The building fell silent again, but now the quiet felt malevolent, pregnant with threat. Every shadow could conceal a muzzle flash, every broken window a sniper's nest. Irina Kozlova. Koenig's voice drifted down from above, the German accent making her real name sound like a curse. Do you know how long I've been looking for you? Katya said nothing, continuing her careful advance. Let him talk. Every word gave away his position and state of mind. 6 months, Koenig continued. Ever since Kharkov, when you put a bullet through Hauptmann Weber's skull. He was my spotter, my friend. Did you know that when you squeezed the trigger? The mention of Kharkov sent ice through her veins. Weber, she remembered him now. Young, blonde, barely old enough to shave. She'd killed him because he was calling out Soviet positions to German artillery. She'd done it without hesitation, without thought for who might miss him. I studied every kill you made after that. Koenig's voice echoed off the concrete walls, making it impossible to pinpoint his exact location. Learned your patterns, your preferences. You favor the left shoulder when the target is moving right to left. You prefer shots between 300 and 400 meters, close enough for certainty, far enough for safety. Katya reached the stairwell and peered up into the geometric shadows above. The stairs were intact but exposed, a killing ground if Koenig had them covered. She needed another route. You're very good, Irina, but you have a weakness. She found what she was looking for, a service ladder set into the wall, leading to the upper floors through a narrow maintenance shaft. The opening was barely wide enough for her shoulders, but it would conceal her approach. You care too much, Koenig continued. Every shot you take, you're protecting someone. Your squad, your city, your country. It makes you predictable. Katya began climbing, the metal rungs cold against her gloves. Above her, weak light filtered down through gaps in the shaft ceiling. She moved slowly, testing each handhold to avoid creating noise. I don't have that weakness. For me, this is simple mathematics. Trajectory, wind speed, distance. There's no emotion in the equation. She reached the second floor access and paused. Koenig's voice seemed closer now, maybe 1 floor up, if she could emerge behind him while he was focused on the stairwell. But you want to know the real difference between us? Koenig's tone shifted, becoming almost intimate. You're fighting for something larger than yourself. I'm fighting for the joy of watching you die. The shaft above her exploded in a shower of concrete fragments. Koenig had found the maintenance ladder. Katya kicked open the second floor access and rolled out as bullets whined through the space she'd occupied. She came up running, heading for the eastern wall, where fire damage had created a series of irregular holes between floors. Behind her, she heard Koenig moving through the shaft with surprising speed. He'd anticipated her escape route, maybe even herded her toward it. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She wasn't hunting anymore. She was being hunted by someone who knew her better than she knew herself. The game had changed completely, and for the first time since Leningrad, Katya felt the cold touch of real fear. The abandoned textile factory stretched before Katya like a concrete tomb, its skeletal frame pierced by artillery holes that let in fingers of grey morning light. She moved through the debris with practiced silence, her rifle cradled against her chest, every sense tuned to the slightest disturbance. The German sniper was here somewhere. She could feel his presence like a cold weight pressing against her spine. 3 days had passed since their deadly game began in earnest. 3 days of cat and mouse through Stalingrad's ruins, each hunting the other with methodical precision. The German had proven himself worthy of his reputation, anticipating her moves, forcing her to constantly adapt. But Katya had survived this long by being better than worthy. She had survived by being lethal. She paused beside a massive loom, its metal frame twisted by shrapnel into abstract art. Through a gap in the factory wall, she could see the apartment building where she'd made her last confirmed kill, a machine gunner who'd been terrorizing her comrades for days. The shot had been clean, professional, but it had also revealed her position to watching eyes. The German knew her patterns now. Worse, he seemed to know things about her that went beyond mere tactical observation. The note he'd left pinned to Corporal Dimitri's body yesterday had made that abundantly clear. Lady Death grows careless when she thinks of home. Does she still dream of the farm? No one here knew about the farm. No one knew about her father's sunflower fields or the old hunting rifle he'd taught her to use when she was barely tall enough to shoulder it. That information belonged to a different life, a different identity, one that should have died the moment she'd enlisted. A faint scraping sound echoed from the factory's upper level. Katya froze, controlling her breathing, listening. The sound came again, boot leather against concrete, trying to be silent but not quite succeeding. She smiled grimly. Even the best hunters made mistakes when they grew impatient. Moving like a shadow, she found the twisted remains of a staircase and began to climb. Each step was calculated, tested for loose debris before committing her full weight. The cold metal bit through her gloves, but she ignored the discomfort. Pain was temporary, death was permanent. The second floor opened into a maze of collapsed walls and hanging cables. Katya could see where someone had moved recently. Dust patterns disturbed, a piece of rubble shifted slightly out of place. She followed the trail like a bloodhound, her rifle ready. "You're very good, Ekaterina Volkov." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the concrete walls until she couldn't pinpoint its source. Her blood turned to ice. He'd used her real name, not the sanitized version in her military records, but the name she'd been born with. "I wondered when you'd finally speak," she called back, keeping her voice steady despite the hammer of her heart. "Getting lonely out there?" A low chuckle resonated through the ruins. "Lonely? No, but curious, certainly. Do you know how long I've been hunting you specifically? Not Lady Death, the propaganda symbol, but you, Katya, from the sunflower farm outside Astrakhan." She was moving as he spoke, using his voice to mask her footsteps. There, a flash of field grey behind an overturned machine. She raised her rifle, found the spot in her scope, but held her fire. Something felt wrong. Too easy. "You're wondering if it's a trap?" The German continued, his accent crisp despite the echoing acoustics. "Good instincts. Your father taught you well before the state took over your education." "My father's been dead for 5 years, Katya replied, shifting position again. The muzzle flash from her words would give away her location if he was watching for it, but she needed information more than concealment now. Cancer, wasn't it? Died cursing Stalin's name for the collectivization that destroyed his farm. Funny how that detail never made it into your recruitment file. The words hit her like physical blows. She'd never told anyone about her father's final bitter months, the way he'd withered not just from disease but from watching his life's work absorbed into the state machinery. That information existed nowhere in any official record. "Who are you?" she whispered, abandoning any pretense of hiding. "Someone who knew you before you became a killer for the motherland. Someone who remembers when you were just a girl who could shoot bottles off fence posts at 200 meters. The voice was closer now, perhaps 30 meters to her left. But something in the tone nagged at her memory, a familiar cadence beneath the formal German pronunciation. "Impossible," she breathed. "Nothing is impossible in war, little sister. Nothing except going home again." The rifle fell from her nerveless fingers, clattering against the concrete floor, because suddenly she knew that voice, knew it stripped of its careful German accent and military precision, knew it despite 5 years and a war that had devoured everything she'd once held sacred. Her brother stepped out from behind the concrete pillar, Wehrmacht uniform immaculate, sniper rifle held casually in his arms. "Hello, Katya." The abandoned theater's broken chandelier cast fractured shadows across the debris-strewn stage where Katya had taken position. 3 days had passed since her encounter with Koenig in the pharmaceutical district, and the German sniper's psychological warfare had escalated beyond mere bullets. Bodies of Soviet soldiers now appeared throughout her hunting grounds, each arranged in deliberate poses with notes pinned to their uniforms, fragments of intelligence about her past that should have been buried in classified files. He knows about Mikhail, she whispered to herself, studying the latest message through her scope. Her brother's death in the purges had been the catalyst that transformed a village hunter into the Red Army's most feared marksman. That information existed in only one place: NKVD headquarters in Moscow. Major Petrov materialized beside her like a ghost, his political officer's uniform immaculate despite the building's decay. "The messages trouble you, Comrade Volkov?" It wasn't a question. Katya kept her rifle trained on the street below, where German patrols moved with increased caution. Someone's feeding him intelligence. Or perhaps he's simply more resourceful than we anticipated. Petrov's tone carried an undercurrent she couldn't identify. The Reich has many ways of obtaining information about their enemies. A movement in the bombed-out department store across the square caught her attention. Koenig's rifle barrel, a brief glint of metal quickly withdrawn. He was there, had been watching them. The realization that she'd led Petrov directly into the German's crosshairs sent ice through her veins. "We need to move," she said, already gathering her equipment. "Flesh wound," Petrov gasped, pressing his good hand against the injury. "He could have killed me." But Katya understood the message's true meaning. Koenig was demonstrating his reach, his ability to strike at will. More disturbing was his choice to wound rather than kill, a psychological tactic designed to unnerve her further. They descended through the theater's bombed-out back sections, Petrov moving stiffly but maintaining pace. The building's basement connected to the city's storm drain system, a network Katya had mapped during her first weeks in Stalingrad. The tunnels provided movement between positions without exposing herself to Koenig's overwatch. "Tell me about the intelligence leak," she said, as they navigated the narrow passages by flashlight. Petrov was quiet for several steps. "What makes you certain there is one?" "Because the alternative is that Koenig has supernatural powers of deduction." She stopped, turning to face him in the tunnel's confines. "Those details about my family, about Mikhail, they're not in any standard military file?" The political officer's eyes reflected the flashlight beam strangely. "Perhaps it's time you knew the full scope of your mission here." Something in his tone made her hand drift toward her sidearm. "What are you talking about?" "Koenig isn't just any German sniper. He's SS Oberführer Markus Koenig, former head of intelligence operations in occupied Poland. The man knows things about Soviet operations that he shouldn't. Names, locations, personnel files. Moscow believes he's turned one of our own." The tunnel suddenly felt smaller, more confining. "And you think I'm the traitor?" "I think you're bait," Petrov said quietly. "Your reputation, your skills, they were perfect for drawing Koenig into the open, but someone's been feeding him information to keep this game alive, to draw out the real objective." Katya's blood chilled. What real objective? Before Petrov could answer, the distinct whistle of an incoming artillery shell filled the air above them. The impact shook dirt from the tunnel ceiling, and somewhere in the distance, masonry crashed down in thunderous cascades. They emerged from the drainage system into the basement of a collapsed apartment building. Through gaps in the rubble above, smoke and dust filtered down like grey snow. The artillery bombardment was systematic, targeting the specific blocks where Katya had been operating. "He's calling in strikes on your positions," Petrov observed, binding his shoulder wound with strips torn from his shirt. "Koenig's not just hunting you anymore, he's trying to flush you toward something." Katya studied the pattern of explosions through a shattered window. The German was herding her eastward, toward the industrial district where the fighting had been particularly vicious. But why that direction? What waited for her there that Koenig wanted her to find? Her radio crackled with an encrypted transmission from headquarters. Petrov moved to answer it, but Katya's trained ear had already caught something that made her stomach drop. The voice on the other end spoke with a slight accent, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably German. She looked at Petrov with new understanding. The political officer met her gaze steadily, no longer bothering to hide what she'd finally recognized. "You've been asking the wrong questions, Comrade Volkov," he said softly. The real question isn't who's feeding Koenig information. It's why Moscow wanted you to find out. The cellar beneath the bombed pharmacy reeked of carbolic acid and death. Katya pressed herself against the crumbling brick wall, her rifle cradled across her chest, listening to the methodical footsteps above. 3 pairs of boots, German jackboots by the sound of their heavy tread on the splintered floorboards. She had been running for 6 hours now, ever since the close call at the textile factory. The Austrian's voice still echoed in her mind, speaking her real name with casual familiarity that made her skin crawl. How long had he been watching her? How much did he truly know about Elena Volkov, the girl who had died in a Moscow apartment fire that never happened? The footsteps stopped directly overhead. Dust filtered down through the gaps between the floorboards, settling on her shoulders like grey snow. Through the fractured ceiling she could hear muffled German voices. One word made her blood freeze: Keller, cellar. They knew she was here. Katya's eyes swept the basement, cataloguing every shadow, every potential exit. The main staircase was suicide, but there, a coal chute in the far corner, partially collapsed but wide enough for her slim frame. The opening would put her in the alley behind the building, assuming the building still had a back wall. A boot heel struck the floor above with deliberate force. 3 times, then silence. He was testing her nerves, she realized. The Austrian knew the psychological game as well as the physical one. He wanted her afraid, wanted her to make a mistake born of panic. But fear was an old companion now, as familiar as her rifle's weight. She had learned to make it serve her rather than master her. The first German soldier appeared at the top of the cellar stairs, his silhouette framed against the pale light filtering through the ruined pharmacy above. Katya didn't move, didn't breathe. Her position in the corner shadows would hide her for perhaps 30 seconds once they began their descent. Not long, but long enough. 2 more soldiers followed the first. She could see their weapons now, chair rifles and stick grenades hanging from their belts. Standard Wehrmacht troops, not SS. That meant they were likely conscripts, not fanatics. They would be methodical but not suicidal in their search. The lead soldier spoke quietly to his companions, then began descending the wooden steps. Each creak of the old boards seemed to echo like thunder in the confined space. Katya's finger found her rifle's trigger guard, though she knew firing would only reveal her position and bring more troops running. When the soldier reached the cellar floor, she could see his face clearly. Young, maybe 19, with the pale, haunted look of someone who had seen too much death. His hands shook slightly as he raised his rifle, sweeping it across the basement's dark corners. The other 2 soldiers descended, spreading out to cover more ground. Standard search pattern. They had done this before, many times. How many Soviet soldiers had they found cowering in similar holes? How many had died in cellars just like this one? One of the soldiers moved toward her corner, his boots crunching on broken glass from shattered medicine bottles. 10 feet away, 8, 6. Katya's muscles coiled like springs, ready to explode into motion. She would have to kill him silently, then deal with the others before they could raise an alarm. But then a voice called down from above, sharp, commanding, Austrian-accented German. The soldiers froze, then hurried back toward the stairs. She caught fragments of the exchange, something about movement in the adjacent building, orders to search there instead. The Austrian was redirecting them, pulling them away from her hiding spot. Why? As the soldiers' footsteps faded overhead, Katya remained motionless for a full minute, struggling to understand. Was it a trap? Some elaborate game to flush her into the open? Or did the Austrian have a different reason for wanting their confrontation to remain private? When she was certain they were gone, she crept toward the coal chute. The opening was smaller than she had hoped, but desperation gave her flexibility. She squeezed through the gap, emerging into the narrow alley behind the pharmacy. Snow was falling again, fat flakes that would help obscure her tracks, but also make movement more treacherous. The alley stretched in both directions, both ends choked with rubble from collapsed buildings. She chose left arbitrarily, moving in a low crouch along the brick wall. A rifle shot cracked through the air, impossibly close. The brick beside her head exploded in a shower of fragments. She threw herself forward, rolling behind a pile of frozen corpses that had been stacked like cordwood against the alley wall. Elena Volkov. The voice came from somewhere above and behind her, calm and conversational despite the chaos. "I thought you might choose that exit. You always were predictable in your unpredictability." The Austrian. He had anticipated her escape route, positioned himself accordingly. How well did this man know her patterns, her thoughts? The realization that she was facing someone who understood her methods better than she understood his sent ice through her veins. The first shot came at dawn, splitting the air where Katya's head had been moments before. She rolled behind a concrete barrier as brick exploded in a shower of dust and fragments. Her heart hammered against her ribs, not from fear, but from recognition, the trajectory, the timing, the precision. This wasn't random artillery or a lucky German patrol. Koenig had found her. She pressed her back against the cold concrete, mind racing through the previous night's movements. She'd been careful, used 3 different routes, doubled back twice, yet somehow he'd anticipated her position, known exactly where she'd set up her morning observation post. The realization hit her like ice water. He wasn't just tracking her movements anymore, he was thinking like her. Another shot rang out, this one punching through the wooden crate she'd placed as a decoy 20 meters to her left. Katya closed her eyes, listening to the echo bounce off the surrounding ruins. The sound came from the northeast, somewhere in the skeletal remains of what had been a textile factory. But Koenig was too smart to stay in one position after revealing himself. She needed to move, but first she had to know how much he truly knew. Carefully she removed her wool cap and placed it on the end of her rifle barrel, then slowly raised it above the barrier. The response was immediate. A bullet tore through the fabric exactly where her forehead would have been. Too fast, too accurate. He'd been waiting for exactly that movement. "Clever girl," a voice called out in accented Russian, the words carrying across the frozen wasteland between them. But not clever enough. Katya's blood turned to ice. Koenig speaking Russian was unexpected, but what terrified her was something else, the casual familiarity in his tone, as if he knew her personally. "Did you really think we wouldn't discover the truth about our famous White Death?" His voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, bouncing off the ruins. Katya Orlova died in a factory fire in 1941. "So who are you really, little ghost?" Her hands trembled as she checked her rifle. He knew, somehow impossibly, he knew her real identity was buried with that name. But how much more did he know? Did he know about her brother? About why she'd taken Katya's place? About the photographs hidden in her pack? A third shot shattered her water bottle, sending precious liquid spilling across the frozen ground. The message was clear. He could kill her whenever he chose. This was psychological warfare now. She had to get moving. The longer she stayed pinned down, the more time Koenig had to maneuver into a killing position. Katya began crawling toward a gap in the concrete where a drainage pipe offered a potential escape route. The metal was slick with ice, barely wide enough for her shoulders. As she squeezed through, another shot sparked off the pipe inches from her boot. Her heart lurched. He could see her, which meant he was closer than she'd calculated, probably moving parallel to her position while she'd been trapped behind the barrier. The pipe opened into a flooded basement filled with floating debris and the stench of decay. Katya waded through knee-deep water, her legs already going numb from the cold. Above her, footsteps crunched through snow, steady, measured, confident. He was tracking her route, probably using the disturbed snow to follow her path. She reached a collapsed stairwell and began climbing toward street level, rifle ready. But as her head emerged from the basement, she found herself staring down the barrel of a Carabiner 98K. Koenig stood 20 meters away, partially concealed behind a burned-out truck. Even at this distance, she could see his pale eyes through the scope, the slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He looked exactly as she'd imagined, tall, lean, with the predatory stillness of a born killer. "There you are," he said softly. For a heartbeat, they faced each other across the frozen street. Two apex predators, each with a rifle trained on the other. Katya's finger rested on her trigger, knowing she had perhaps half a second before he fired. Then the rumble of approaching tanks filled the air. Soviet T-34 seconds, by the sound of their engines moving up from the south. Koenig's eyes flicked toward the noise for just an instant. Katya rolled sideways as his shot scorched the air where she'd been. She came up behind a pile of rubble, already working the bolt, chambering another round. When she looked up, Koenig was gone, vanished like smoke into the maze of ruins. But something had changed in that brief moment when their eyes met. She'd seen something in his expression. Not just the cold calculation of a sniper, but recognition, personal recognition. He didn't just know her assumed identity, he knew her face. The tank engines grew louder, covering her movement as she sprinted toward better cover. But even as she ran, one terrible question echoed in her mind. If Koenig knew who she really was, how long before he discovered why she was really here? And what would he do when he learned the truth? The wind howled through the skeletal remains of what had once been Stalingrad Central District, carrying with it the acrid smell of cordite and decay. Katya pressed herself against the crumbling wall of a bombed-out apartment building, her rifle clutched tight against her chest. 3 days had passed since her encounter with the German sniper in the factory ruins, and she hadn't seen so much as a muzzle flash from his position. The silence was more unnerving than any artillery barrage. Sergeant Volkov materialized from the shadows like a ghost, his face etched with exhaustion. Dark circles ringed his eyes, and his usually pristine uniform hung in tatters. "Any sign of him?" he whispered, settling beside her in the rubble. Katya shook her head, never taking her eyes off the distant buildings. "He's patient, more patient than any German I've faced before." She paused, studying the maze of destroyed structures that stretched before them. "He knows this city now, knows it like we do. Command is getting nervous. The offensive is scheduled to begin in 48 hours, and they can have a phantom sniper picking off officers during the advance." Volkov pulled out a crumpled cigarette, thought better of it and tucked it away. "They're talking about pulling you back." The suggestion hit Katya like a physical blow. "No, this isn't finished. Katya, listen to me." "He knows who I am, Volkov." The words came out harder than she intended. "He called me by name. My real name, not my father's name or any call sign. He knows about my past, about—" She trailed off, unwilling to voice the rest. Volkov's expression darkened. "What aren't you telling me?" Before she could answer, a sharp crack echoed through the ruins. Both soldiers flattened themselves as brick dust showered down from above. The shot had come from the southeast, at least 400 meters away. "Movement," Katya whispered, pointing toward a gap between two collapsed buildings. "Third floor of the red building, window on the left." Volkov squinted through his binoculars. "I don't see anything." Another shot rang out, this one closer. A Soviet soldier stumbled and fell in the courtyard below them, clutching his shoulder. The wounded man's comrades dragged him to safety, shouting warnings about snipers. "He's toying with us," Katya realized. "Those weren't kill shots. He's drawing us out." She began moving before Volkov could protest, crawling along the debris-strewn floor toward the building's rear exit. Her mind raced through the geometry of the urban battlefield, calculating angles and sightlines. If the German was in the red building, he had excellent coverage of the main approach routes. But there was a weakness in his position, a blind spot created by the collapsed water tower. The journey took her nearly an hour, moving in short bursts between cover. Each step was calculated, each pause measured. She had learned patience in these ruins, learned to think like the stones and steel that surrounded her, but as she moved, memories she had long suppressed began to surface. Berlin, 1936. The Olympic Games. A different life, when she had been someone else entirely. The German sniper's voice echoed in her memory. "I know exactly who you are, Katerina." She pushed the thoughts away, focusing on the immediate threat. The red building loomed ahead, its facade pockmarked with shell holes. She counted the windows, memorizing each potential firing position. The smart play would be to wait for backup, to coordinate with the other units in the area, but something told her this was meant to be personal. As she approached the building's eastern wall, she caught a glimpse of movement in a fourth-floor window. Not the third floor where she had expected, but higher. The German had anticipated her approach, had moved to maintain his advantage, always one step ahead. Katya slipped through a breach in the wall, finding herself in what had once been a grocery store. Broken glass crunched under her boots despite her careful steps. She winced at each sound, knowing that her opponent was listening for exactly these tells. The stairwell was a death trap, too exposed, too predictable. Instead, she found a hole blown through the floor above and began climbing through the building's interior, using the debris as a makeshift ladder. Each floor brought new challenges, weakened support beams that threatened to give way, gaps in the flooring that opened onto deadly drops. On the third floor, she paused. Above her, she could hear movement, deliberate, careful, professional. He was repositioning again, but this time she was close enough to track him. She checked her rifle, ensuring the bolt moved smoothly despite the cold. One shot was all she would get. The floorboards creaked overhead, and she followed the sound with her eyes, mapping his position. He was moving toward the western windows now, probably trying to get a better angle on the Soviet positions below. Katya found a hole in the ceiling large enough for her purposes and began her final approach. As she climbed, she wondered if he could hear her heart hammering against her ribs, if somehow her fear would give her away. Just another shot, she told herself. Just another target, but she knew it was a lie. The cellar reeked of cordite and death. Katya pressed herself against the crumbling brick wall, her breath forming ghostly wisps in the frigid air. Above her, the building groaned under the weight of fresh snowfall and artillery damage. She'd been trapped here for 3 hours, ever since Hoffman had driven her from her perch in the factory ruins. Through a gap in the foundation stones, she could see the courtyard beyond. 20 meters of open ground separated her from the next building, 20 meters that might as well have been 20 kilometers with Hoffman watching. She'd spotted the glint of his scope twice, each time from a different position. He was mobile, methodical, patient, just like her. The irony wasn't lost on her. For months, she'd been the predator stalking through Stalingrad's skeleton, picking off enemies who never saw death coming. Now she understood what it felt like to be prey, to feel invisible crosshairs tracking every breath. A rat scurried across her boot, seeking its own shelter from the carnage above. She envied its simplicity, survival without the weight of identity, without the burden of being Katya Volkov, the ghost of Stalingrad. Hoffman's knowledge of her real name had shaken something fundamental inside her. The carefully constructed legend she'd built was cracking, revealing the frightened girl from Tula underneath. Footsteps crunched in the snow outside, multiple sets, moving with the cautious rhythm of a patrol. German voices drifted through the broken walls, too muffled to make out words but clear enough to understand the danger. They were searching building by building, floor by floor. Hoffman was using infantry to flush her out, driving her toward his waiting rifle. She checked her weapon. 4 rounds left in the magazine, 1 in the chamber. Not enough for a prolonged engagement, but it would have to suffice. Her spare ammunition was back at her previous hide, now certainly compromised. Every shot would need to count. The voices grew closer. A beam of pale sunlight shifted across the cellar floor as someone moved past the window above. She could hear them in the main floor now, boots scraping across debris, calling out room clearances in clipped German. Professional, thorough, deadly. Katya closed her eyes and let muscle memory guide her hands as she checked her gear. Knife secure, grenades 2 remaining. Her rifle felt heavier than usual, or perhaps that was the weight of desperation. She thought of Mikhail, probably dead in the factory collapse, of Dmitri and the others who died believing in the legend she'd become. Their sacrifice demanded more than cowering in a cellar. The first German appeared at the cellar entrance, his silhouette framed against the grey sky. Katya's bullet took him in the chest before he could raise his weapon. His body tumbled down the wooden steps as his comrades shouted warnings. She rolled left as automatic fire chewed chunks from the wall where she'd been crouching. 2 grenades clattered down the stairs. She grabbed one and hurled it back up before diving behind a pile of rubble. The explosion shook dust from the ceiling and sent echoes rolling through the underground space. Screams followed. The second grenade detonated where she'd thrown it, silencing the voices above. But the silence wouldn't last. More soldiers would come, and Hoffman would be waiting for her inevitable emergence. She needed a different exit, a way to break the pattern he expected. The cellar extended further than she'd initially realized. In the far corner, partially hidden by fallen masonry, she found what looked like a coal chute. The opening was narrow but navigable, angling upward toward what had once been an alley behind the building. It would put her in Hoffman's blind spot, if she could reach it without triggering the remaining German forces. She army-crawled across the cellar floor, using shadows and debris for concealment. The chute was even tighter than it appeared, forcing her to push her rifle ahead while wriggling through the confined space. Ice had formed along the metal sides, making progress treacherous. Behind her, she could hear new voices in the cellar, cautious but determined. The chute opened into a narrow alley choked with rubble and abandoned equipment. She emerged slowly, scanning for threats, her rifle ready. The position offered multiple escape routes and clear sightlines to several potential sniper nests. For the first time in hours, she felt like a hunter again rather than hunted prey. Movement caught her eye across the street. A figure in winter camouflage shifting between windows in a half-destroyed apartment block. Hoffman. He was repositioning, probably expecting her to emerge from the building's main entrance. His discipline was impressive, but it also created an opportunity. Katya settled into a firing position behind an overturned truck, her crosshairs seeking the man who knew too much about who she really was. The warehouse reeked of cordite and frozen blood. Katya pressed herself against a concrete pillar, her breathing creating small clouds that dissipated quickly in the frigid air. Somewhere in this labyrinth of twisted metal and shattered machinery, Koenig was hunting her with the same methodical precision she had once used against his comrades. Her rifle felt heavier than usual, the metal stock cold against her cheek as she peered around the pillar's edge. The buildings stretched before her like a frozen cathedral of industrial decay, with catwalks suspended overhead and massive equipment creating a maze of shadows and blind spots. Perfect terrain for a sniper duel, except she was no longer the predator. A metallic ping echoed from somewhere above. Katya immediately rolled left as a bullet sparked off the concrete where her head had been. The sound came from the eastern catwalk, but by the time she brought her scope to bear on the position, Koenig had already moved. Ghost-like, just as her instructors had warned her Nazi snipers could be. She needed to think differently now. For months she had been the hunter, learning the patterns of enemy soldiers, anticipating their movements, exploiting their mistakes. But Koenig wasn't making mistakes. He knew her reputation, had studied her methods, and worst of all, he knew about Miriam Goldstein, the Jewish girl who had supposedly died in a pogrom years ago but had instead been reborn as Katya Volkov, the Red Army's deadliest sniper. Another shot, this time from ground level near the western wall. The bullet shattered a chunk of ice near her left shoulder. He was forcing her to move, herding her towards something. But what? Katya sprinted between 2 massive lathes, their silent hulks providing momentary cover. As she ran, she tried to map the warehouse in her mind, remembering the entrance points, the structural weaknesses, anything that might give her an advantage. The building had 3 levels, the main floor where she crouched now, the catwalk system 20 feet up, and a small supervisor's office overlooking everything from the northwest corner. The office. That's where she would position herself if she wanted to control the entire space. She belly-crawled under a conveyor belt, the metal grating scraping against her back. From this angle, she could see part of the catwalk system, empty. But that didn't mean Koenig wasn't there, just that he was better at remaining invisible than she had anticipated. A whisper of sound made her freeze, footsteps on metal, so light they might have been imagined. But Katya had learned to trust sounds that others dismissed. Someone was moving on the catwalks, heading toward the supervisor's office. She aimed upward, tracking the sound, when she realized her mistake. The footsteps were too obvious, too rhythmic. Koenig was drawing her attention upward while he maneuvered somewhere else entirely. But where? The answer came in the form of falling snow through a hole in the roof, fresh snow, disturbed by something moving above. He wasn't in the building at all anymore. He was on the roof, probably accessing it through the supervisor's office window. Katya rolled out from under the conveyor belt and sprinted toward a staircase leading to the catwalks. If Koenig was above her, she needed elevation to have any chance of engaging him on equal terms. Her boots rang against the metal steps, stealth abandoned for speed. She reached the catwalk level and immediately dove prone as another bullet whistled past her ear. This shot came from directly overhead, confirming her suspicion. Koenig had the high ground and a clear view of most of the warehouse interior, but rooftops worked both ways. If he could see her, there were positions where she could see him. Katya leopard crawled along the catwalk toward the supervisor's office, splinters of metal raining down as Koenig's bullets tracked her movement. He was firing rapidly now, trying to pin her down, which meant he was either running low on ammunition or preparing to change positions. She reached the office door and kicked it open, rolling inside just as another bullet punched through the thin metal wall. The room was small and spartanly furnished, with large windows overlooking the warehouse floor and one smaller window facing north toward the roof access. Through the north window, she caught a glimpse of movement, a flash of white camouflage against the grey sky. Koenig was repositioning, probably moving to a spot where he could fire down through the hole in the roof. Katya steadied her rifle on the window frame and waited. Patience had always been her greatest weapon, the ability to remain motionless for hours until the perfect shot presented itself. But now patience felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. Every second she remained stationary was another second for Koenig to outmaneuver her. Then she saw him, a brief silhouette against the sky as he moved between two sections of roofing. She adjusted her aim, accounting for wind and distance, and slowly squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed through the warehouse like thunder. The explosion had blown out what remained of the factory's eastern wall, leaving twisted metal beams jutting into the snow-filled air like broken ribs. Katya pressed herself against the concrete, feeling the vibrations of artillery shells landing closer with each barrage. The Wehrmacht was making another push, and she was trapped between the advancing infantry and the knowledge that Heinrich Moller was somewhere in the ruins behind her. Blood seeped through the makeshift bandage around her shoulder, where shrapnel had found its mark 3 hours earlier. The wound throbbed with each heartbeat, but she'd endured worse. What gnawed at her wasn't the physical pain, but the psychological warfare Moller had been conducting since dawn. He'd left 3 bodies in her path, Soviet soldiers each killed with a single precise shot to the head. Each corpse had been positioned to send a message. He was herding her toward something. Through the scope of her Mosin Nugget, she surveyed the bombed-out administration building 200 meters north. Its skeletal frame offered dozens of shooting positions, any one of which could hide the German sniper. The smart play would be to retreat, to find Dmitri and the others and fight another day. But Moller had made this personal when he'd whispered her real name across the radio frequency. Katya Volkov was supposed to be dead, buried in a mass grave outside Leningrad with the rest of her family. Only 3 people had known the truth about her identity, and 2 of them were already dead. A rifle crack echoed from the administration building, followed by a scream from the German advance line. Someone else was shooting, picking off Wehrmacht soldiers as they moved through the rubble field. Katya adjusted her scope, scanning for muzzle flashes. There, 3rd floor, eastern corner. But the shooter wasn't Moller. The silhouette was too small, the movements too quick. Her radio crackled. Little bird, your friend is quite resourceful." Moller's voice carried an amused undertone. but sending the boy to help you was a mistake. Ice formed in Katya's stomach. Dmitri, the young partisan, had been ordered to fall back with the others, but he'd always been too stubborn for his own good. Now he was in the building, drawing fire and creating chaos, completely unaware that the deadliest marksman on the Eastern Front was hunting in the same space. She had to move. Staying put meant watching Dmitri die, and she'd seen enough good people sacrifice themselves for her already. Katya chambered around and sprinted toward the administration building, using the cover of smoke and falling snow. German voices shouted orders as machine gun fire raked the ground behind her feet. The building's lobby was a cathedral of destruction. Broken glass crunched under her boots as she moved toward the stairwell, rifle ready. The air reeked of cordite and death. Bodies in both German and Soviet uniforms lay scattered among the debris, testament to the vicious close-quarters fighting that had claimed the building multiple times over the past weeks. On the second floor, she found the first sign of Dmitri's passage, a dead Wehrmacht sergeant with a knife wound to the throat. The boy was moving upward, methodically clearing each level. Smart tactics, but it would make him predictable to someone like Moller. The German would be waiting, letting Dmitri do the work of eliminating other threats before closing the trap. Katya climbed faster, her shoulder screaming in protest. On the third-floor landing she heard voices, Dmitri's harsh whisper and another voice responding in accented Russian. Too calm, too confident. Moller. She rounded the corner to find them in what had once been an office space. Dmitri crouched behind an overturned desk, his rifle trained on a doorway across the room. But Moller wasn't there anymore. He was behind Dmitri, rising from beneath a pile of rubble like death itself, his Gear 43 aimed at the back of the boy's skull. Katya's shot took Moller in the shoulder, spinning him sideways. He rolled with the impact, bringing his rifle around toward her position. She dove left as his bullet splintered the doorframe where her head had been. Dmitri scrambled for cover, finally understanding the trap he'd walked into. "Now we dance properly," Moller called out, his voice tight with pain but still controlled. "No more games, Ekaterina, just you and me and the truth." The truth. He still thought he held all the cards, still believed her identity was his weapon to wield. But Katya had spent months in this frozen hell, learning that the past only had power if you let it. She wasn't the terrified girl who'd watched her family die. She was something harder now, something forged in the crucible of Stalingrad's endless winter. Outside, the artillery barrage intensified, and she could hear German voices getting closer. Whatever ended, this had to happen fast, before they were overrun. Katya checked her ammunition. 4 rounds left, enough if she made them count. She caught Dmitri's eye and pointed toward the window. When the next shell hit, they would move. The explosion from the collapsed building sent tremors through the frozen ground beneath Anya's feet. Dust and debris rained down like snow as she pressed herself against the skeletal remains of what had once been a bakery. Her breathing came in sharp, controlled bursts that crystallized in the bitter air. Somewhere in that wreckage, Heinrich Weber lay buried, or so she hoped. But hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. Not in Stalingrad, not against him. She waited, counting the seconds, watching for any sign of movement through the settling cloud of pulverized concrete and mortar. The Mosin Nagant felt heavy in her hands, its metal components so cold they threatened to freeze to her exposed fingertips. Around her, the sounds of the greater battle continued. Distant artillery, the chatter of machine guns, the occasional scream that cut through the winter air like a blade. 3 minutes passed, then 5, still nothing. Anya began to move, keeping low, using the rubble-strewn street as cover. She needed to confirm the kill, to see Weber's body with her own eyes. Only then could she return to her unit, to report that the ghost haunting the Soviet lines was finally laid to rest. The building had collapsed almost entirely, leaving only fragments of walls jutting up like broken teeth. Steam rose from the ruins where hot pipes had burst, creating an eerie fog that danced in the pale afternoon light. She approached from the eastern side, rifle ready, every nerve ending screaming with alertness. That's when she saw the blood trail. Dark droplets led away from the building's remains, partially obscured by fresh snowfall but still visible to her trained eye. Her heart sank. Weber had survived, wounded, perhaps, but alive, and wounded animals were often the most dangerous. The trail led toward the industrial district, where the skeletal remains of factories provided countless hiding spots for a skilled sniper. Anya followed, her boots crunching softly on the mixture of snow and glass that carpeted the street. Every shadow could conceal death. Every window frame could hide the muzzle of a rifle. She was 3 blocks into her pursuit when the first shot rang out. The bullet sparked off the metal beam beside her head, sending fragments of ice and rust into her face. She dove behind an overturned truck, her mind racing. The shot had come from the northeast, from the direction of the tractor factory, but the angle was wrong for a direct line of sight. Weber was using ricochets, banking shots off metal surfaces to hit targets around corners. Brilliant and terrifying. Another shot, this one punching through the truck's thin metal skin inches from her shoulder. Anya rolled away, using a pile of debris as cover. Weber was moving, changing positions between shots, never firing from the same location twice. It was exactly what she would do. She caught a glimpse of movement in a 3rd-story window of the factory's administrative building. Without hesitation, she brought her rifle up and fired. The window frame exploded in a shower of wood and glass, but she knew she'd missed. It had been a shadow, a trick of the light, or a deliberate decoy. The real shot came from ground level, from behind an overturned piece of heavy machinery. The bullet grazed her left arm, tearing through her winter coat and drawing blood. Pain flared, sharp and immediate, but she forced herself to ignore it. Wounds were just information. This one told her she was getting careless. Anya sprinted toward a concrete barrier, zigzagging to make herself a harder target. Behind her, Weber's rifle cracked twice more, the bullets whining past close enough to feel their passage. She reached cover and immediately began moving again, unwilling to stay static long enough for him to line up a killing shot. The factory complex stretched before her like a metallic maze. Conveyor belts frozen in place, massive machines standing silent as monuments to interrupted production. Steam hissed from broken pipes, creating pockets of concealment and confusion. It was perfect sniper country, and she was walking directly into it. But she had no choice. Weber knew her identity, knew about her past. As long as he lived, she was compromised. Her family, her comrades, everyone she cared about was at risk. This had to end here, in this frozen hell of twisted metal and broken dreams. She found his blood trail again near the main entrance to the factory floor. More drops, fresher now. He was bleeding steadily, which meant she'd wounded him more seriously than she'd initially thought. Good. Every advantage mattered now. As she stepped into the vast, shadowy interior of the factory, Anya felt the weight of inevitability settling around her like a shroud. One of them would leave this place alive. The other would become just another casualty in Stalingrad's endless appetite for death. The hunter and the hunted, locked in their final dance among the monuments of industrial ambition. Outside, the war raged on, but here, in this moment, there was only the deadly mathematics of trajectory and timing, only the whispered promise of the perfect shot. The rifle felt heavier than it ever had, as Katya pressed herself against the crumbling brick wall. Blood seeped through her makeshift bandage, each heartbeat sending fresh waves of pain through her shoulder. The Nazi sniper's bullet had found its mark, but not deep enough to end her, not yet. 3 days had passed since Heinrich Müller had revealed he knew who she really was. Not just Senior Lieutenant Katya Volkov, the ghost of Stalingrad, but Ekaterina Dimitrova, the baker's daughter from Leningrad, whose family had died in the siege. The knowledge sat between them like a loaded weapon, transforming their deadly game into something far more personal. The factory district stretched before her in ruins, smoke rising from a dozen fires. Soviet forces had gained ground overnight, pushing the Germans back toward the Volga, but at terrible cost. Bodies littered the streets, frozen in grotesque positions where they'd fallen. The living moved between them like ghosts, searching for ammunition, food, anything to survive another day. Katya adjusted her scope, scanning the skeletal remains of Factory 615. Muller was somewhere in that maze of twisted metal and concrete. She could feel his presence like a wolf, sensing another predator. For weeks, they had stalked each other through Stalingrad's arteries, leaving a trail of bodies and close calls. Now, with the German line collapsing, this would be their final dance. A glint of metal caught her eye. 3rd floor, northwest corner. Too obvious. Muller was better than that. Katya shifted her position, ignoring the fresh burst of agony from her wound. The real shot would come from somewhere unexpected, somewhere that offered both concealment and an escape route. The sound reached her first, a whisper of displaced debris from the building to her left. Instinct threw her sideways as the bullet shattered brick where her head had been. She rolled, came up firing, but Mueller was already gone, a shadow moving through shadows. "You're slowing down, little wolf." His voice echoed from multiple directions, bouncing off the ruins. He was close, maybe 30 meters. "That shoulder wound is worse than you're admitting." Katya said nothing. Words were weakness now. She belly-crawled toward a pile of rubble, using it to mask her movement. The snow helped, muffling sound, but it also left tracks. Muller would read them like a map. Another shot, this one shattering concrete inches from her elbow. He was herding her, she realized, pushing her toward something. A trap, or simply better, killing ground. She reversed direction, scrambling through a gap in the wall that led into the factory's lower level. The interior was a cathedral of destruction. Massive machines lay toppled like fallen giants, their metal faces pocked with shrapnel. Steam pipes leaked ghostly vapor into the frigid air. Katya moved carefully, rifle ready, every nerve screaming danger. The words hit harder than any bullet. Katya's hands trembled, and she forced them still. This was psychological warfare, meant to cloud her judgment. But knowing that didn't make it hurt less. "Your little brother called for help until the smoke took him. What was his name? Pavel?" "Yes, Pavel. He was brave, I'll give him that." Rage flooded through her, white-hot and pure. Katya moved without thinking, climbing toward the sound of his voice. She reached the catwalk and saw movement 50 meters away, a figure in winter camouflage moving between the pipes. The shot was impossible. Too far, too many obstacles, her shoulder screaming protest. She took it anyway. The bullet sparked off metal, missing by centimeters. Muller spun toward her, his own rifle rising. For a heartbeat, they stared at each other across the killing ground, two apex predators finally face to face. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 25, with pale eyes that held no warmth. A small scar bisected his left eyebrow, human details that made him somehow more terrible, not less. "There you are," he whispered. They fired simultaneously. Both rounds found their targets. Muller's bullet punched through her thigh, spinning her around. Her shot took him high in the chest, slamming him against a support beam. But he didn't fall. Blood spread across his jacket, but he kept moving, kept fighting. They were both dying now, racing to see who would succumb first. Katya dragged herself behind cover as another bullet whined past her ear. Her rifle felt impossibly heavy. Each breath brought fresh agony. The factory floor below seemed very far away. Outside, the battle for Stalingrad raged on. Artillery thundered in the distance. Men died by the hundreds. But here, in this moment, the war had narrowed to just the two of them. Hunter and hunted, locked in their final dance. The wind howled through the skeletal remains of the factory district, carrying with it the acrid smell of cordite and death. Katya pressed herself against the crumbling brick wall, her breath forming crystalline clouds in the bitter air. 3 days had passed since she'd last seen the German sniper, but she could feel his presence like a phantom limb, always there, always watching. Her fingers, numb despite the wool-lined gloves, traced the familiar contours of her Mosin Nagant. The rifle had become an extension of herself over these blood-soaked months, but now it felt foreign, inadequate. How do you kill a ghost who knows your every move before you make it? The radio crackled beside her. Raven, this is command. Report your position. She keyed the mic with trembling fingers. Grid 77. No visual on target. Understood. Be advised. Civilian evacuation is proceeding through Sector 9. Keep the corridor clear. Katya's blood chilled. Sector 9 was exposed, a killing field if ever there was one. The German would know about the evacuation. He always knew. She clicked off the radio and began moving, her boots silent on the frost-covered debris. The journey through the ruined streets felt like walking through a graveyard of civilization. Broken dolls lay scattered among spent shell casings, their porcelain faces staring blindly at the grey sky. She had to reach the overwatch position before the crack of a rifle split the air. Katya dove behind an overturned streetcar as the bullet sparked off the metal inches from her head. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she processed what had just happened. He'd missed. The legendary German marksman had actually missed, unless he hadn't meant to hit her. Another shot rang out, this one shattering a window directly above her previous position. The pattern became clear. He was pushing her north, toward the old cathedral, the same cathedral where this nightmare had begun weeks ago. Katya sprinted from cover to cover, using the rubble-strewn streets to mask her movement. Each time she tried to deviate from the northward path, another precisely placed shot would force her back on course. It was masterful, she had to admit, like a chess grandmaster moving pieces across a board of bone and ash. The cathedral's broken spire came into view, its once proud cross, now a twisted mockery against the gunmetal sky. As she approached the entrance, Katya's mind raced through possibilities. This had to be a trap, but perhaps she could turn it to her advantage. She knew this building, had memorized every stone during her weeks of urban warfare. The heavy wooden doors hung askew on their hinges. She slipped inside, immediately struck by the eerie silence. Her footsteps echoed in the vast space, bouncing off the vaulted ceiling. Stained glass windows, somehow miraculously intact, cast colored shadows across the debris-littered floor. You came. The voice spoke perfect Russian, tinged with a slight accent. Katya spun toward the sound, rifle raised. There, in the shadows of the altar, stood a figure in a Wehrmacht greatcoat. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30, with pale eyes that seemed to hold depths of weariness. You're him, she said, not lowering her weapon. As you are her, the white death of Stalingrad. He stepped forward, and she could see he carried no rifle, only a pistol holstered at his side. Do you know why I brought you here? To kill me. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. To talk. In this place of peace, what little remains of it. Peace? Katya's voice cracked with incredulous rage. You've brought nothing but death to this city. As have you. His pale eyes never left hers. We are the same, you and I. Instruments of war, shaped by forces beyond our control. I know what they did to your family. I know why you fight. The rifle trembled in her hands. How could he know about her parents, her brother? The memories threatened to overwhelm her, the smoke, the screams, the Wehrmacht soldiers laughing as they... It doesn't matter, she whispered. Doesn't it? This war will end someday. What then? What becomes of killers like us when there's no one left to kill? For a moment, silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Then Katya heard it, the distant rumble of approaching tanks, Soviet tanks. The German heard it too. His hand moved slowly toward his pistol. They're coming for me. Yes. And you'll let them take me? The great white death, sharing her kill? Katya's finger found the trigger. No. The shot echoed through the cathedral like thunder, final and absolute. As the German sniper fell, Katya felt something die within her too, not just her enemy, but the part of herself that had lived for this moment. Outside, the tanks grew closer, bringing with them the promise of victory and the weight of survival.